got Jackie Boyer with me today and Ryan Astalos with SalmonState. Thank you both for being here with me today. And let's just jump right into it. Jackie, what brought you to SalmonState?
Well, I mean, I personally align with the mission. Like, who doesn't love salmon in Alaska? Kind of what it comes down to. But like my background, I kind of fell into policy work right outside of high school and did an internship in our state legislature. And I adopted my siblings, and like I'm Indigenous, so like it's kind of ingrained in my culture to like be a steward and to take care of our lands and waters and everything. So when this opportunity opened up for this position and to work at Salmon State, I kind of jumped at it, and I absolutely love everyone at the team.
What is your position with SalmonState?
So I work on the Stop Trawl Bycatch campaign, and I'm relatively new to this organization, but I've, in previous positions, I've always partnered with them and always appreciated the work here.
Cool. Ryan, what about you?
Yeah, after graduating college, I started door knocking against the Pebble Mine in an effort to protect Bristol Bay. Since then, I have worked in different organizations, different positions, and started working part-time with SalmonState back in 2017. And when the opportunity arose for a full-time position, I jumped on it. I really love working with SalmonState. Just like Jackie spoke about, the work that we are doing and the people that we work with is really important to me. And I think, so my role at SalmonState has kind of evolved over time, but I'm our operations director, and that kind of lumps in a lot of different tasks, whether that be admin work, outreach, going to different events, and then also our social media and our website. So kind of all over the board.
SalmonState's social media is actually pretty awesome. I've been following just for a few months, actually. I found out about SalmonState through one of the Facebook pages. Stop Alaskan Trawler Bycatch is the name of the Facebook page, and it's huge. There's like 44,000 people that follow this, and I'm assuming people that live in Alaska and beyond. But I reached out to the admin for that page, David Bays, and he was excited about wanting to discuss this type of issue on the podcast, and suggested, I believe it was him. He suggested it. It could have been someone else. I talked to a few people on that page about it, but they were like, "You need to talk to SalmonState." And so I look up SalmonState, and one beautiful website, clear cut on what you all are about, what you're doing in the state, the issues that are important to, I feel like most Alaskans. As I look through that, if you're an Alaskan, the things that SalmonState are doing, I think you probably should be, or if not already, concerned about as far as protecting our land, protecting our salmon. They're issues that are unique to us. So when I reached out to SalmonState, I talked to Mary Catherine, and she was quick to say, "We'll find someone for you." And I appreciate that so much because I think it's important issues that that you are working on, and that we should discuss so that other people can get in on that too. So this is both of your full-time jobs, right? That's awesome. So this isn't just something you're doing on a volunteer basis. This is your life in a sense, and I appreciate you all sharing that with me today. So I want to learn more about SalmonState. So what would you say the mission of SalmonState is?
Yeah. So SalmonState works to ensure that wild salmon and the people that depend on them thrive. Kind of our name is born out of Alaska, or making sure that Alaska remains the salmon state, right? Just kind of as you noted, everybody should be connected to the issues that we work on. They might not always agree with everything that we say, but salmon are a key connector with Alaskans, and that's the work that we do, is for the people and for the fish.
So we're going to talk today about stopping trawler bycatch, but that's just one of a few issues Salmon State is concerned about and working on. Is that right? What are some of the other campaigns that you guys have going on?
Yeah, I kind of mentioned it in my intro, but I'm sure the majority of Alaskans know about the Pebble Mine that's proposed in Bristol Bay. This is one of the issues that Salmon State's been involved in for years, along with local, the United Tribes of Bristol Bay and other partners. We've come to the table to work on that issue. In addition to that, there's several mines on the British Columbia side of the border in Canada, at the headwaters of the Stikine, Unic, and Taku. Kind of similar impacts of the Pebble Mine, but on the Canadian side, that would impact Southeast communities. So we're concerned about that. We're also looking to, uplift Southeast communities to kind of give the direction that they want to ensure that salmon streams, trout streams, recreation, tourism is all important to the Southeast community and economics, and make sure that logging isn't destroying that habitat, because that's really important to those fish populations. In addition to that, we're also working on the proposed West Susitna Industrial Access Road, which is kind of a state-funded 100-plus mile road that would go from Big Lake out to the Alaska Range for potential mining claims. This would cross 180 streams. It would at least be $600 million, probably more with our inflation and construction prices these days. And then also, just making sure that public spaces remain protected for opportunity for Alaskans to recreate, hunt, fish, and live a subsistence lifestyle. So, we are really concerned with freshwater habitats through all these different campaigns that I just mentioned. But we're also concerned with the ocean space in the way of trawl bycatch. Salmon in particular, as everyone knows, is anadromous, and so they live in both environments. And so that's important for Salmon State.
I think salmon are important to the state, no doubt. I'm trying to think of a way that to kind of relate it to people that maybe they don't eat salmon, maybe they don't fish, but they're still important to the state. They're important to a lot of, even though they might not be important to you specifically wherever you live, there's other communities that rely on salmon population, the return of salmon. What is, or I guess, why is protecting salmon such a critical issue, so much so that this organization exists?
Like, from like my perspective, and so like I really got into this work because of like indigenous ways of life and like how much we're interrelated to marine life and land on the water, or mammals and everything that is kind of ingrained in who we are. And so I mean, salmon is just kind of the lifeline, the lifeblood of indigenous communities. And like, growing up, everything is kind of interrelated to like seafood, like growing up. And my grandma would tell me stories and like cut fish. And, I like to think about, or like when I get discouraged about things, like I go back to thinking about processing salmon with my grandma. And so like with each salmon that she would cut, she would, tangibly give me the heart of each one and like tell me a story about growing up and cutting salmon with her grandma and, generations before. And that's like a way of life that existed, since time immemorial. And so that's why I think it's so critical that we work to protect this, because it's a place that's always been connected to salmon. And, it's our duty to like make sure that continues for the next generation and the next generation, just the way that it's gone on for generations prior. So that's kind of where my heart's at for this work.
Yeah, that's awesome. It does put into perspective that it's more than just a fish that spawns and goes out to the ocean and comes back. It's a lot more tied to that, for sure. So today we're going to talk about trawling. As like predominantly, we're going to be talking about trawling. For those that don't know, what is trawling?
Yeah, I can start off with that. So, there's a lot of specifics that go into each type of gear, and so I'll kind of explain this on a generalized level. So you can have two groupings, basically. You have bottom trawling and then midwater, or it's also known as pelagic trawling. And so then on top of that, you have catcher vessels, which are trawling vessels that go out and catch the fish, and then they have to offload that fish, whether it be shoreside processing or a mothership. So a mothership would be a floating processor, essentially. And so that's a boat that is on the water, and these catcher vessels are bringing that fish to them. Then at the same time, there's also catcher processors, and so they're doing it all on one boat. So it kind of depends. And then to kind of go a little bit more into what pelagic and bottom trawling is. So pelagic is where they're supposed to be in the middle of the water column, right? Catching their fish. But there's been studies that have been done where it depends on what kind of vessel that they're operating, but they're finding that those nets are on the ground from 40 to 100% of the time. And so that has to do a lot with the weight, the fish that they're trying to catch. And there's some issues with the regulations at the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council that there's not actually a clear definition of what that is. They just talk about it in the sense of what the net looks like and not actually how they're fishing. On the other hand, bottom trawling is specifically designed to be on the bottom. You know, it has rollers. They're dragging that net on the bottom in search of those oftentimes flatfish. And essentially, the issues with the midwater touching the bottom is disrupting the habitat, but it also kind of throws in a loophole, right? So you have certain areas that are designated as closed to bottom trawling, and those midwater trawls are able to operate in those areas. But if they're on the ground between 40% and 100% of the time, you know, they're still impacting those areas where they're supposed to be closed, and that's impacting species like crabs where they're molting and spawning corals that grow for hundreds of years, et cetera.
And so these trawlers are targeting, you said either like flatfish on the bottom, but also like, isn't like walleye pollock? Is that like another like highly targeted species of fish also?
Yeah, so largely pollock is midwater.
Okay.
And so that's like kind of when people think about trawling, they automatically go to pollock. You know, these are the fish that are used for fillet of fish at McDonald's and several other fast food restaurants. They are made into fish sticks. They're even coming out with like breaded fillets at supermarkets. And interestingly enough, imitation crab or surimi is ground up and highly processed pollock, made into crab sticks. And so the flatfish are typically flounders, sole, different species like that that are living on the bottom. And one other species that's caught midwater is cod.
How much, like, what's a quantity we're talking about here with these nets and the amount of fish that they're trying to bring in at one time?
Over the course of the year, billions of pounds.
Billions with a B. Yeah, it's a lot. And these nets are enormous in size. I think I've read that they're like or maybe it was on the SalmonState website, like as long as a football field. Like they're huge, right? And like they're trying to target specific species, but in the process of that, other stuff is getting into the net as well, right?
Yeah. So just like you said, they're spread out the size of a football field, and they're indiscriminately catching these species. It kind of tapers down into a cone, which is oftentimes referred to as the cod end, and that is pulling through the water. And in the process, they're indiscriminately catching species that Alaskans care about, whether it be culturally, economically, or just wanting to fill our freezers. So this includes salmon, halibut, crab, herring, black cod, etc. Just a couple years ago, they actually caught orcas, and just this last year they caught another one. And so there's also a lot of marine mammals and sharks and things like that that don't make it onto the publicly available bycatch data. And so then there's left on people or organizations to do what's called a FOIA request. And they're, petitioning the government essentially to release that data. And when they do, they being NOAA, it's highly pixelated. And so then those organizations then have to follow up and sue the government to actually see what these vessels are actually bycatching. So it's really problematic.
Can you clarify what NOAA is? Yeah.
National Oceanic and Atmosphere Administration.
Okay. So is this all across I'm thinking about Alaska as a state. We got a lot of ocean, we border a lot of ocean, we got a lot of coastal communities. Where is this trawling happening?
Yeah, so it's a good question. A lot of the problem and the majority of the trawling happens in federally managed water. Mm-hmm. So that's between 3 and 200 miles off the coast of Alaska. Okay. And so there's Gulf of Alaska, and then there's also the Bering Sea. And that's where a lot of the trawling is occurring. There's one state-managed pollock trawl fishery that occurs in Prince William Sound. It's a rather short season. It goes from January 20th to March 31st. Although this year they wrapped up rather quickly because they met their quota. So they were already done fishing Prince William Sound by February 18th because they had caught 9 million pounds of pollock.
Yeah, those numbers are hard to grasp, but when you think about the amount of fish that they're taking in it seems crazy because it's every year after year. I'm assuming, right? They didn't just start trawling. Trawling has been going on for a while, I'm guessing. Who are the major players in this trawling industry? Are these companies based in Alaska? Are they out of state? Are they internationally? Like you mentioned, was it 200 miles outside of Alaska? Is considered federal water. So could they be? Are there international players here, or is it? Are these all companies based in the state that are doing this?
Yeah, so there is international trawling that is occurring, and Russian trawling, that kind of thing. But we're really focused on what we can influence, and that's the federal waters, right? And so a lot of these companies are sending their trawl boats from Washington, Oregon, and then there's a small fleet that's actually based out of Kodiak. Yeah.
Okay, so there are other states basically sending these trawler fleets. It's not just like an Alaska. These aren't just Alaskan companies. They're coming from out of state as well.
Yeah, so this federally managed waters is considered the North Pacific, and so that's managed by the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council. And the members that make up that body include members that are appointed by the Alaska, Washington, and Oregon governors.
Okay. So you mentioned some like mentioned like McDonald's, like filet of fish, some of these other products that are kind of keeping the demand up for these trawlers to do what they do. Um, but as I looked into trawling and what that was, and just to see it from that perspective, they have this claim that it's sustainable is actually the word that they use. And again, I'm just a layman and learning all of this. But when you hear about like the millions and millions of fish that are being taken, we're going to talk about the bycatch, and like when we learn about the amount of fish that are being lost in the process of this, these trawling fleets, it's hard to justify, in my own understanding, that this is something that is sustainable, which means we can do it for a long time, and there's enough, regrowth in return. Like it just doesn't make sense. So back to the question was, who's benefiting from what these trawlers are doing?
Wait, keep going. I don't want to talk over you.
No, you can. Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, hop in.
So, to your question about sustainability, so a lot of trawl caught products kind of make it into the market and restaurants with a stamp of approval, quote unquote. This is the Marine Stewardship Council. That you might see a little stamp, a little blue fish stamp on products such as the fillet of fish. And those are dubbed as sustainable. That body, certification body, might have good intentions. They do certify sustainable fisheries, like certain ways of salmon fishing, for example. However, it is a little bit of a pay-to-play game. And so whenever you have a multi-billion-dollar industry like the trawl industry, that is pretty easy for them to pay for this blue washing, if you will, right? And so whenever folks have come to trust this blue fish stamp and they're in the supermarket, they will see that it's sustainable. But, unfortunately, it's not, because of the number of species that are becoming victim of bycatch. There's also issues with bottom trawling ruining the habitat on the ocean floor. There's also been studies that have been done that is contributing to carbon emissions by rototilling the seafloor, essentially. So there's that. There's also claims that the trawl industry will like to call that they're sustainable based on percentages. And so they're taking in such a large consumption of this white fish, whether it be pollock or flatfish, whatever, that, they can put out, we're only at 1% bycatch.
But 1% is like maybe millions or like a significant amount.
Yeah.
Wow.
Exactly.
Wow.
So
that's wild. So I do want to talk about the bycatch issue now, because as you're talking, I'm hearing like two issues simultaneously, and that's how long can you possibly take the species that you are targeting, and then what about the species that we're losing that you aren't targeting? It's like two things happening simultaneously that I feel like there's a problem there if they're just allowed to kind of do what they do. And it doesn't sound like with much like regulation involved, or like they kind of have freedom to do whatever they want because of being billion-dollar industries, when the smaller fishermen, or the as a sports fisherman, we get the notifications like, hey, Kings are closed this year, or there's not low return of salmon this year, and it's like we're feeling it on at the very bottom when they're just allowed to kind of do whatever they want to. Seems kind of messed up. So you mentioned some of the things that these trawlers are affecting. How is trawling affecting Alaska's salmon populations and the overall ecosystem health?
I mean, with trawling in Alaska. So, as Ryan was talking about, the size of a football field, their nets, when, it's the loaded weight of a Boeing 747, which is massive. So in 2023, they caught 10 orcas. Like, could you imagine accidentally catching an orca or like much less 10? So like trawlers come into Alaska, or federal waters, and they catch and discard more than Alaskans are, along the Yukon are allowed to harvest. And like, you know, you can go back to the percentages and whatnot, but like, one subsistence user, one sports user, if they catch, a king salmon, and not follow the regulations, they lose their license, they lose their fishing gear, and they're like, you can't fish. Versus a big industry that's allowed to continuously catch and discard and kill, you know, thousands upon thousands and, millions of pounds of marine life and just toss it overboard and, it's business like usual.
Yeah, and that's just what's wild is that it's not usable. Like it's not just like, oh, these fish that we didn't target are in our net, let's just let them go. Like they're probably going to die. Like like the chances of them living after being caught in that, those giant nets has to be pretty slim. And you're so right. Like, the regulations come down hard on the fishermen, and yet these huge industries are just kind of let loose to do what they want. Are there any like visual or emotional stories that stick with you when talking about this issue?
So, like, with the last in-person North Pacific Fishery Management Council meeting in February, so that was the largest in-person gathering of, Indigenous people that I've seen. And it was, days and hours of testimony. And like, I encourage people to go back and listen, and, maybe we can send you links to some pretty heart-wrenching stories, but, communities have been feeling it, and it's, it was lots of tears, lots of, pointing back to this is our way of life. Like, we matter too. Like, how can you put industry above Alaskans and like not hear us and not like elevate our issues to like mean as much? It just comes back to like, it's almost a humanitarian crisis. That actually is a humanitarian crisis. Like, why is an industry allowed to flourish, have subsidies, have like this green or blue washing, while Alaskans who've like been here, live here, recreate here, lived here for forever, like feel the brunt of it versus, Seattle-based trawlers who just come to Alaska to get a paycheck. So, those stories of my, one story was like, my grandson doesn't know the taste of salmon. And that breaks my heart because like, it's really hard to put into words because it's so connected to who we are, and it's heart-wrenching. Yeah.
Can you talk about, you mentioned Yukon earlier, and that's the Yukon chum salmon return has been, I've seen it in the news for the last few years, I feel like. But can you talk about that specifically? Like there's those communities on the Yukon that are feeling the brunt of this?
Yeah. And so with chum specifically, there is no chum bycatch limit in federal waters. So,
so they're not even, it doesn't matter to them, right? Like they don't have to even report it basically?
I mean, it's reported, but
Okay.
there's no limit on it.
Wow. So for some species, there are limits, but with chum salmon, there are no limits. However, there's communities on the Yukon that have been relying on the chum salmon return, right? Yeah. That's wild. It's sad. It's not wild. It's sad. 'Cause like you're saying, it's generations of people, a way of life ingrained in culture, so much more than just, going to the grocery store to pick up, your food. Like this is food that you have relied on coming to you generation after generation, and now it's either slowed down or completely stopped in some cases, right?
Yeah, for sure. And then also, like, if you've seen prices for groceries in rural Alaska, so like went back home a couple months ago after my grandpa's passing, and I was gonna buy my aunt some groceries, and it was just for basic necessities, is well over $200 for not even a week of food, and it's just like, how is this fair? Is kind of the broader question. Like, we've lived here for forever, and it's so ingrained into our culture and just our ways of life, and somehow you have to go to the council and lobby and ask for basic needs to be met. um, it's just frustrating and just heartbreaking.
So we talked about the numbers a little bit. Who is reporting the numbers? Is it the trawlers that are required to do the reporting? Is there like third party reporters? Because I feel like when we're talking about like millions, or billions annually, there has to be some like, a small error can still mean a lot, right? So is it the trawlers that have to do the reporting?
Yeah, so there is onboard observer coverage that does happen. This is federally certified. A lot of those observers are third party, though. And so, in addition to that, there's also electronic monitoring, and that occurs in the Bering Sea and in the Gulf of Alaska. There's an opt-in program happening in the Gulf where, just to give an example, just last fall, there was 2,000 Chinook salmon that were bycaught by 2 vessels in one day. And those were caught, or excuse me, it was observed on electronic monitoring. And if those boats did not have that capability, who's to say that the members of the public would have known that actually occurred? Yeah.
So I feel like the issue at this point is pretty lined out as far as, we're losing a lot of species species of fish that Alaskans rely on, both intentionally. The trawlers are trying to target specific species, and then unintentionally with all this bycatch. So how does this change? Like we talked about, there's some federal aspect to this, then there's a state aspect to this. For this to change, where do we begin?
I just need to add on to that last answer real quick.
Oh, sure.
So in addition to onboard observers and electronic monitoring, those short side processors are also verifying that bycatch number as well.
Gotcha. So when they get to shore, they're also third party, though, you said?
Well, they're processing.
Oh,
so
gotcha.
it's the processing plants.
Gotcha. The processing plants. That makes sense because they're seeing the actual product that's coming through. Okay. So as far as the change aspect, do we start, with our local governments, like in Alaska? Like, is it our representatives and our senators that have the say? Or are we just subject to whatever the federal government wants to do? Like, how do we work that out?
You want me to start and you can add in? Sounds good. Right. So like with all like movement building and, when you're tackling such a huge issue like this and, a multi-billion-dollar industry, like every space that you can bring it up. So like starting with our, state legislature. So there is, as Ryan talked about, one state managed trawl fishery. And while it's only one, it signals to the federal government that Alaskans care about this issue. Mm. There's also polling showing that 74% of Alaskans want to ban trawling outright, which is huge.
Yeah.
I don't think I know of any other polling that's that high.
Yeah. It's hard to get everyone to agree about something. A lot of Alaskans agree that trawling is probably a bad idea.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bipartisan issue. Yeah, it's, totally. Everyone loves Alaska and our salmon and our marine life and, this way of life that it, impacts everyone. So, there are ways, you can contact your, local legislator and say like, I support this. I support banning. I want to see a resolution put forward to ban trawling in Alaska. I want to support legislation that encourages the federal government to, take action on this issue and whatnot. And then, for the, congressional level, our representatives can introduce legislation to change the structure of the North Pacific Fishery Management Council, which manages, our federal fishery. And then also like just with social changes, Ryan is really great on our sticker campaign. And so that's just one way of showing that you support changing the system. So, every little act adds to the bigger movement building of, stopping this unsustainable practice.
Yeah, I mean, and you touched on the politics side of it. I think people try to pick which box this fits in for them, if it aligns with their party or not, regardless of what that is. But this is one of those things that I feel like transcends that if you're an Alaskan. And I think that's the beauty of it, is that we can all get behind that we're kind of being taken advantage of with the resources that we have in our waters, with our wild salmon species there. And then we're losing out on the ability to feed our families and to keep this resource coming back to us year after year, because these trawlers are basically taking so much from us in the state. We're just kind of left to suffer, and unless we speak up and do something in a united front as Alaskans, it's probably not going to change. So I think that it's good that one, we're doing things like this. You guys are very active in the state, and like you said, reaching out to our representatives and our senators. I do want to touch on something. I got a letter back from a petition response from Senator Murkowski. I had sent, this was about a month and a half ago, just saying that I was in favor of banning trawling. And the response, which I assume it's like a canned response that they just send out to everyone, was that, the reduction in salmon return is, due to climate change, as well as she did acknowledge trawling. But she mentioned, that climate change could be a part of that. And I'm not like a climate change denier. I think that, the climate does change. But to the amount of like fish that we're losing objectively, we can see on, paper, I feel like if you're trying to change something, it's much harder to change the climate than it is to address these nets in the water. And she did say that she was working on the issue by doing a couple things. One of those is, let me just pull it up here. So she mentions increasing the funding for the NOAA Bycatch Reduction Engineering Program. So she said she was increasing the funding for that, but I'm like, how does funding help the bycatch issue if nets are still going in the water? Can you guys speak to that at all, as far as what that program is, or if there's any, if there's any hope in that program?
I can start. I think that, well, first of all, SalmonState recognizes that trawling is not the singular issue that is affecting our decline in species, whether that be salmon or halibut or crab. But it's a very large contributor, and it's something that can be changed. It's a human activity that can go through regulation change, gear type change, etc. And so, I just wanted to be clear about that. And then as far as funding research goes, I think that that's important. We need to come at these solutions with a science based approach, but we also need to come at it at an ecosystem based approach. A lot of the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council, they have a statistical and science committee, and they're recommending things to the council. There's an advisory panel that is also recommending things to the council before they take these votes. And I think that one thing that they, need to take into account is that they're managing for a singular species, a species that is going to make money. This all falls under NOAA, which is currently under the U.S. Department of Commerce. So, this is an industry that's driven to make money, and it's not necessarily for the health of our ecosystems and the species that are centered. So, I think that there's part of that. And I think that, there's also like a kind of a negative connotation that can happen with some of this funding for research and stuff. And that is that like, oh, well, we need to study this and see what those impacts are. And so that will take a handful of years. Whenever we know that there is the destruction that's happening currently, we're past the time of action, and we need to take that action now. We know the effects of trawling. We can see that there's several places across the globe that have actually banned trawling because of its negative effects. And trawling in federal waters off the coast of Alaska started back in the early 80s, I think. And so like, it's they've kind of gotten away with a lot, and it's high time that we need to take drastic action to make change.
Yeah, no, I agree. There's, research sure is great, and we should be looking to science in some ways to address this issue, or to learn more, to educate ourselves, or to make adjustments. But like you said, like we know the effects right now. So those changes, could potentially happen right now if we did it right, and we got the right people involved, and we're able to, stand up to these, this huge industry. The other thing that she had mentioned in her letter back regarding the issue was, again, it was another funding, research funding program. This was the Bristol Bay Science and Research Institute chum salmon bycatch genetic analysis testing. So she said that if successful, that it would improve the pollock fleet's ability to avoid Western Alaska chum salmon bycatch. So I looked into that a little bit just to like figure out what that meant. At first glance, I was like, are we genetically creating chum salmon now? Like that's what I thought it was. Like, are we doing like GMO chum salmon? But it was not that. It was, I think, more or less trying to identify maybe like location, like where they were going to be at, so that the trawling fleet could like avoid those areas. Is that right?
Well, I could start off by just saying that the trawl industry, generally speaking, likes to kind of push the issue of chum bycatch under the rug, so to speak, because a lot of the genetic data that you're talking about points to Asian hatchery fish. But again, when we talk about these large percentages that the trawl industry likes to take, they're not accounting for all of the thousands of fish that are bound for Western Alaska. So just, to give you an example, 51,000 chum salmon were genetically tested that were bound for Western Alaska salmon in 2021. And the trawl industry wrote that off because like, oh, well, there's hundreds of thousands of chum salmon that are being bycaught, but they're from Asia hatcheries. And so it's fine. And I think that the reality is it can't be that management system can't be dictated by a genetic marker. We need to be able to have these chum salmon return to their natal streams and not get bycaught by this industry.
Yeah, you'd mentioned other countries facing the same issue and coming to the conclusion that they had to ban it. Which areas was that? Which areas in the world have done that? And what did they do to be successful?
Yeah, we can look at different countries that have taken action to ban bottom trawling. So if we look at in 2015, Chile, noted sponges and corals as reasons to ban trawling in certain areas. And then in 2024, the UK, Greece, and Sweden also banned bottom trawling. And then right here at home, but in Southeast Alaska specifically, In 1998, a group of fishermen petitioned to stop trawling. And so trawling is actually banned in Southeast Alaska. And that was an action that was, taken by the federal government. So this is a possible change that we can make. It's definitely an uphill battle, but it is possible.
That's awesome, and that's good to hear. It would be a shame to get to the point of salmon aren't returning, that the trawlers leave Alaska waters because they've decimated the population. It would be a shame for trawling to end because of that. It would be so much better for us to address it now, so that we can ensure that these populations continue to thrive and in some cases regenerate and come back, to our, the streams that, they respond at forever ago.
Yeah, and I'll just add real quick that this is actually trawling as a gear type has phased out essentially on the East Coast because their target species crashed. And so you're absolutely right that we need to be forward thinking and make sure that we don't overfish what we have.
Yeah. A little bit of off topic, I guess, maybe not, but we were talking about what we can do as far as communicating with our elected leaders and, letting them know that this is an issue for us. It's an Alaskan issue that we want to be addressed. Recently, Governor Dunleavy brought up the concept of fish farming, which I thought was, I'll just say, very interesting. I know Alaska is desperate to create revenue streams and to figure out how to get out of a deficit and to make money. But the idea of fish farming, when we are having such a difficult time managing our wild species, just seems very bizarre. What are your thoughts on that?
I can go ahead and start. So essentially, SalmonState is very opposed to fish farming. Fish farming, whether it's in the ocean or on land, can produce diseases to our wild populations by various different means. Whether it be spread by flooding, birds, air, etc. It also can really compete with our wild seafood market and small boat fishermen. And so, we need to be really concerned about that. And the current bill that's proposed leaves the 5 species of salmon, Pacific salmon, off of the, it leaves the 5 Pacific salmon off of the table for this current iteration. But if this bill were to pass, it could be a stepping stone to allow salmon farming in Alaska, and that's just not something that we as Alaskans can let go. Yeah, there's a famous bumper sticker out of Sitka: "Friends don't let friends eat farm fish."
Yeah, and I feel like that was the general. At least I can only speak to my circle of friends and my circle that I have, but yeah, when the fish farming, it's in HB 111. When that got brought up, we were just kind of like, what? Fish farming? We have such bigger fish to fry, for lack of a better term. But I'm glad SalmonState feels that way. I can't imagine that you guys would be all, yes, fish farming is the way. It seems like we needed to be good stewards of what we have right now before we start trying to generate something out of nothing. So I do want to talk about kind of the path to influencing some type of meaningful change here. So, Jackie, like you said earlier, this is likely an issue that most Alaskans would agree on. Who is arguing that trawling is a good idea, or is it just the trawlers?
I mean, it is the trawlers. I think I would be a little sorry. I mean, it is the trawlers, but I'd be a little remiss to not acknowledge that there's CDQs in Alaska, or community development quota programs, in Western Alaska, and that's kind of a nuanced conversation to be had. And my family being from Western Alaska, and it's complicated. It, like, personally, not, I can't speak behalf on of SalmonState on this, but it feels like with investing and trawling in that area, it feels like you're getting robbed and then getting $5 back. So you can't fish, but you have this program that will you know provide some economic value back to the region. And it's just complicated, and it's unfortunate, and it makes me it makes me pretty sad to think about. But going back to the bigger issue, this larger industry that's not Alaska based shouldn't be taking our resources, is kind of the broader conversation to be had, and something that we're focusing on. Um, like, why are we allowing this to happen?
So what can like everyday Alaskans do? Now maybe they didn't know about this issue, maybe they're better informed about this issue. What is the next step in your opinions that kind of gets momentum behind this for some type of meaningful change?
Well, I think currently what you can do is contact your elected officials, and also understanding that whenever election season rolls around, that this is an issue that our politicians, our elected leaders, have control over, especially our governor, because he's nominating the most seats to the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council. SalmonState's a 501c3 entity, and so we can't support or oppose a candidate, but it's important to know that these issues are impacted by the election of a governor. Also, just our congressional delegation that's working in Washington, D.C. Can, write legislation that will update fishing practices, reauthorize the Magnuson-Stevens Act, things like that. Introduce bills like our previous representative, Mary Paltola, that were talking about bottom trawling and things along those natures. I think that also, the council meets 5 times a year, and so there's opportunities to comment to them written ahead of time, and also testifying in person.
Can I just add one thing? So, like, as Ryan was talking about, the governor's role in, nominating seats to the council. So he submits names, it goes to the Secretary of Commerce. The Secretary of Commerce is basically kind of like a rubber stamp. So, it makes sense to defer to the state and whatnot, but that process is inherently flawed. So the governor just submitted those names in March, and it's not an open process, right? So, like, a few people put their name in. There's no public list. There's no way to submit, like, comments other than emailing boards and commissions, and you're not sure who all is there. So it's mostly like an insider baseball game feeling. And so there was an article that came out, and Alaskans just found out that it's the governor submitted, the same industry representatives to the council. And, like, I'm a big nerd on civic engagement and public policy, and, like, to me that feels like inherently flawed. You need to be able to engage and have a conversation with your local government and who represents you on this huge council that impacts all of Alaska.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the names are already submitted, so you could contact the Secretary of Commerce, but there isn't, like, a front-facing public engagement opportunity, which is really unfortunate. So, like, honing in on, there needs to be a better public process.
Yeah. And I'm learning now that the governor's role is, I guess, a lot larger than I thought it was in all of this. I assumed, it'd come from Senator Dan Sullivan or Senator Lisa Murkowski, Representative Nick Bycatch. Those are the people that come to mind first. when I think of like who I need to contact to change this, but from what you are saying, is it a lot of, at least the council that has a lot of influence is appointed by the governor. So I'm assuming we can reach out to the governor's office as well about this.
Yeah, and just to kind of throw one more level, when we talk about that state-managed pollock trawl fishery in Prince William Sound, that regulatory body is the Board of Fish. Same process. Well, it's a little bit different, but same idea, where the governor is appointing these members to the board, and then the legislature approves them. So there's actually 2 nominees in front of the legislature right now.
And that is a public process. Okay. So you can submit comments, versus with the North Pacific, there isn't an oversight hearing.
I see. Okay. So looking ahead, if you were to give your magic, I call it a magic wand solution, like where you're like, this, I'm going to wave a wand and I'm going to fix everything. In not to play the devil's advocate, but just from the trawler standpoint, they are trying to make money, and they are targeting a species because of the demand. The demand is there, so they're trying to fulfill that. So looking at it from their perspective, from our perspective, how do you meet the demand, and how do you reduce bycatch or eliminate it? Is there a magic wand solution for this issue?
I'll just start off by maybe posing a question. Okay. When it comes to trawling, maybe it's to the point where Alaskans need to ask themselves, is this type of gear still a gear that we want to see fishing our ocean? Right now, we're working with ways to engage with members of the public through a trawl bycatch survey, policy survey, that will be directed to Representative Nick Bycatch. It's something that came out of one of his town halls. He kind of put the question back out to Alaskans: where do you want to see me advocate for? And so we have listed several different ways that him as a representative can take action. And so we're advertising that to the public right now. We want to hear ways not only for the representative, but also to kind of gut check where we're coming from in this work. And a lot of the things that we're already seeing is resonating. A lot of people kind of want to see multiple ways that this is impacted. So whether that be reauthorizing the Magnuson-Stevens Act, or banning bottom trawling, or banning trawling altogether, those are some of the different ways that we can engage. And I think that, we've talked about the poll, for instance. The first time that question was posed to Alaskans was, would you ban trawling off the coast of Alaska and federal waters? 67% of Alaskans said yes. And 2 years later, 74% of Alaskans are saying yes. Mm. So that's also a very important litmus test. Yeah. That, that's a very high number when it comes to polling. We started off this discussion, this chat, talking about our work fighting the pebble mine, which, is in a good spot. Whether, there needs to be more permanent protections in Bristol Bay, but that's in a really good spot. And it's also in a really good spot in the public view, right? People support protecting Bristol Bay, but that number never reached 74% in public polling. That's a good point. Yeah. So, this is a really, really important issue for Alaskans. And I think that anyone that's running for political office in these mediums that we have discussed today, need to be paying attention. And it can't just be a campaign promise. It needs to be a campaign promise that is enacted on.
Good job, Brian.
You agree? Yeah. Jackie's in agreement. So, and I think that's goes into my next question, was what gives you hope for that to be a reality? And I think it's just that many Alaskans are unified on this issue.
Yeah. And then so just adding to what Ryan was saying, and he always speaks so eloquently. Appreciate him. But like, going back to the last in-person council meeting in February, so the advisory panel to the North Pacific Fishery Management Council has one designated tribal seat, and that makes recommendation to the full council. The full council does not have a designated tribal seat, and that's something that many organizations and communities have been advocating for a long time. And specifically at that meeting, you go back and listen and hear, so when you provide testimony, council members will, ask follow-up questions, and, testifiers would say, oh, I defer to Eva, who is the tribally designated seat on the advisory panel. And honestly, she should be on the council. We need to have a voice that represents us other than, the status quo industry. And just looking at that from, the representation standpoint, from like ecosystem-based management, just there needs to be some change to representation to include other voices. And, that's just one of the many things that could be done is, adequate representation.
That's a good point. Right now, you all are here on the Kenai Peninsula. You have an event at Main Street Tap and Grill tonight, which this won't come out probably until, I forgot. I don't even know where we're at right now. End of April, probably end of next month when this episode comes out. But where else is SalmonState going this summer? Any events that you have planned or places where you plan on getting this message out?
Yeah. First off, I just want to thank Main Street for hosting us tonight. They are one of our several businesses. So currently we have nearly 50 businesses that have signed on to take action to stop trawl bycatch. And that's businesses from across the state and even from the lower 48. So if you're a business owner and you're listening, I would encourage you to check out our website, salmonstate.org/bycatch, and join your business as well. And then to answer your question about where we're going to be next, we don't have something on the calendar quite yet. However, we're in the process of planning out our summer outreach. So this will include various different events that will be throughout the road system. And they're events that are already community organized. So things like Salmon Fest and Mermaid Fest and things like that come to mind, farmers markets, things like that. We'll be looking at those types of events to host a table. And then we'll also probably working with other business partners to host something very similar to this Main Street event. The owner reached out to me as we were planning our event back in February at 49 State in Anchorage. And basically, wanted to take that same message to the peninsula, which is great. And I suspect that other people will continue asking us to do that, take a little roadshow. We've also talked about doing an online webinar as well for the folks that aren't connecting to these communities, but still want to hear from the speakers. We tend to work with business partners and people that are impacted on a daily basis on trawl bycatch issue. And so we want to make space for these folks. And so we're doing that. And, we'll be meeting with the business community as well, trying to invite them in to this work as well, because, they might have billions of dollars on their side, but we definitely have the people.
Yeah. So if you're a business owner and you're listening and you want to get in touch with SalmonState, salmonstate.org, ORG, and reach out to them, and maybe you can bring them to your business. They're doing something here on the peninsula, but they're willing to get this message out to whoever's willing to listen. It seems like it's an important issue. And how do people follow what SalmonState is doing?
Yeah. So we're on Instagram and Facebook. We're also just starting on Blue Sky, which is kind of a newer platform. We're also on LinkedIn and YouTube. And then, of course, we've mentioned the website. That's another way. All of our different petitions are going to be there. But we'll be posting different ways to get involved on those social media channels. We also have a weekly newsletter that goes out Saturday mornings. We talk about a lot of the things that SalmonState works on, but there's oftentimes a trawl bycatch section that's featured each week.
Okay, great. Any final thoughts for the Alaskans listening? Anything we didn't touch on or anything that you want to add on?
Actually, I wanted to include in the beginning when we were defining SalmonState, I just want to kind of put this out there. It's something that I started doing because people kind of question who we are and then we're this outside entity. But essentially that, SalmonState is an Alaska-based organization. We have staff in Anchorage, Eagle River, Homer. We also have staff in Juneau, Petersburg, and Haines. So we're kind of spread out and we're working to ensure that Alaska remains the salmon state.
And, just to add to Ryan's thoughts, I often think about, banning trawling in Southeast and how that took like a decade. And, but it's winnable, right? So like you look at these, I wouldn't call them small wins, but like very apparent progression over time. So it's like the more people who take action, who get involved, who voice their opinion, who, sign on their business, who sign on to a petition, who testify before the council, who contact, it takes 2 minutes to email your representative. And so like when you show that support for something that you really care about, you move the needle and things start to change. And, it's a winnable fight. And it's really encouraging to see support and changes to the system. And that, that's what really gets me excited is engagement and, those who represent us actually listening and, changing things. So it's doable.
This is going to be a long fight, but we're here to ensure that wild salmon and the other species that are affected by trawl bycatch, can have a chance to rebound, and the people that depend on those species are able to, harvest them, to put them up, and to ensure that, culture, economics, small businesses in Alaska are protected into the future.
I agree, and I'm hopeful. I think this is a great cause. This is something that comes up more in conversation now, and just in my circle, than I think ever has before. People are talking about this. Every time I see any of our elected officials, put something out on Facebook, it doesn't have to be fishing related. There are people in the comments saying, "What about banning trawling?" Like, they're out there and they're diligent and they're doing great work to basically just not stay silent about this. And so you're right. It only takes minutes to do a petition. That one that I mentioned earlier that I did for Senator Murkowski, it was very short, and it was basically like 2 minutes of my day. And that, now I'm on the radar. I'm another person on the radar that she knows, or her people know, that, trawling is an issue that I care about. Banning trawling is an issue that I care about.
So this is a shameless plug. So in addition to taking action and calling your representatives, we've mentioned that we're up against a multi-billion-dollar industry, right? And so I think that donating to grassroots organizations and tribal organizations, not just SalmonState, we're not the only organization that is involved in this fight. But I think that putting your money behind these various different organizations is important, whether that be $10 or $100. we need ways to get more people involved, and advertising takes money. And I also want to thank you for hosting us, because this is also a way to get the message out there.
Get online, salmonstate.org. You said that there's actually petitions on the website that you can fill out on the website. Great, cool. So yeah, start there if you want to get your name out there and show your support for what Salmon State is doing, and to kick these trawlers out of Alaska. It's our, I'd say, responsibility. Like you said, it's a long fight, but it's worth it, and should start now. So Jackie, thank you so much for coming down to the peninsula. Ryan, thank you, and I hope people learn something today and are encouraged to take action and see this change in a positive way for Alaska.